Hello, we're testing the microphone now.
Yeah. Cool. morning. I'm really excited to have you here. So before we begin, I'd like to introduce the assembly, and then we're going to have a speaker introduction as well before we start the presentation. So the assembly, we are a smart lab and makerspace that's based out of 25. We were founded in 2014, and for the past 8 years, we've had over 350 workshops. Now these workshops happen almost every week on Saturdays, so everyone is welcome. It's for the community. The workshops come in a variety of different topics. The three main categories that we have are hack, and we focus on embedded systems, IoT, usage of hardware devices like the Raspberry Pi or Arduino. For these workshops, we provide the audience with the hardware devices, so you guys can work with us. Then we have code workshops that focus on software aspects, where we work on APIs, frameworks, apps, and for these you don't need to bring your computer, so you just code along. And we also have data science workshops that we focus on artificial intelligence and machine learning. But overall, our topics go from IoT, robotics, 3D printing, AR, VR, cloud computing, and so much more. Our audience members are professionals, they're entrepreneurs, they are students. Everyone is welcome. We want to make sure that in the end, you either learn something new, build something new, or improve and increase on your already existing knowledge. You can follow us on our social media. It's Make Smart Things, which is also our mission statement. We are on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and you can also watch this live stream afterwards and our other live streams that we do on YouTube. It's on our website, theassembly.ae. Now I'd like to introduce one of our interns to do the speaker introduction. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll be introducing the speaker. The speaker today is Chirag Desai. He is the founder of the Amaeya networks, one of the largest, the network UAEs is the founder of Amaeya networks, the UAE's first independent podcast company, and has grown into one of the largest network podcasts in the Middle East and North Africa region. Chirag Desai is a long-term believer in the power of audio and has turned his single passion into a full-fledged company in 2017. Since then, Amaeya Media has launched over 20 shows which are branded and owned, and has published nearly 40,000 audio content. Before venturing into the podcast world, Chirag helped businesses build, manage, and audit the technological needs for over 12 years, and was a certified information system auditor. And now, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Chirag Desai.
Cool, thank you. Can you guys hear me? Do you guys want to move like up a bit? I feel like we're sitting very far away. But anyway, so I've been told not to raise my hands too much, but we'll see how that plays out. Good morning. How is everybody doing? So today, she was mentioning a lot of these very interesting tech and all of these things that they do. Today's a workshop that's not really a lot about that, but it's more about a little bit about content and trying to understand your brand a little bit. They gave me a really nice introduction, but yesterday Nikhil posted this and he called me Mr. Podcast. I felt like that was pretty much the best description I could give myself, so I'm just going to leave that there. But as Hassan mentioned, sorry? I like the Mr. Podcast too. I don't think there could have been a better description for me there, so here we go. But as Hassan mentioned, I've produced over 14,000 minutes now of audio, 625 episodes roughly. We've helped launch 23 shows that are off the region and out of the region. We've got 3 more coming at the end of this month, which I can't really talk about, but I just want to mention that to you guys. The point is, I love podcasts. I love making them. I love working with brands doing that. So I'm gonna go over that a little bit today, kind of give you a sense of what some people are doing, what works, what doesn't work, and hopefully you'll find something to take away from that. Ultimately, it comes down to this mission for me and us as a company, which is empowering conversations, specifically those that humanize the world. What that means for us essentially is that, me personally as well, I believe that conversations can do a lot. They are the starting point for everything and anything. And to be able to do something, to effect change, do anything, we have to start with a conversation. We have to open up a conversation. So that's kind of the thing that guides us when we're trying to build shows and try to bring people to that space. And the same thing applies to brands too, right? Brands ultimately want to connect with communities, connect with audiences, connect with their customers. So as I mentioned, we've done a bunch of different shows with a lot of local brands today. We've got some new ones coming up as well. We also publish reports from time to time about the state of the industry and so on. You'll find them on our website. They're free to download. And so, yeah, and then last year we had a lovely recognition from Apple Podcasts as well, which was quite fun. So, let's get started. We're going to open up with RSS first. Does anybody know what that is? No? So, if for old timers like us anyway, if you remember blogs used to be powered by RSS, right? RSS is essentially a framework on the internet that allows people to connect with each other in terms of content, right? So back in the day, a blog post would be published, you could consume it anywhere, you could publish it anywhere, and so on. Podcasts essentially run on the next version of this technology, although this is about 20-something years old now, which two people, basically, Adam Curry, Dave Weiner, they got together, they spoke about how we can use this framework to actually communicate audio content across as opposed to just text, and then eventually it became about video as well. So the way this works essentially is when you host your content up, it goes into an RSS feed, which is the basic term you need to know. And then all the players, so Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and so on, they pick up on this feed and see their new episodes and so on, right? So it's a pretty simple, connected way to do things. One of the beauties of this is it is an extremely decentralized space. Nobody owns the world of podcasting today, right? So anybody can start a podcast. Anybody can become famous in a podcast. Anybody can grow their audience in a podcast space. So for example, if Apple Podcast doesn't really do much for you, you might have an audience on Spotify, right? You're not locked out, you're not created that. So it is an extremely decentralized space. We'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end. But one of the things about decentralization and Web3, which is one of the lovely buzzwords we're dealing with today, is about ownership of content. Ultimately, you own the piece of content. You're not at the mercy, in a way, of some of the platforms and some of the things we've seen when we look at Twitter and Instagram and that kind of stuff, right? Yeah.
When you set up your podcast, you actually have to, if you own the blog page, you have to actually set up the RSS link.
Yeah, so today, of course, there are a lot of platforms that will help you do this. I mean, any podcast hosting platform, essentially that's what they do. They take your audio file, create the feed for you, right? And then as a starting point, what you do is when you go to Apple Podcasts and Spotify, although again, the hosting companies help you with this, is you go and submit your feed to them so they are aware that the show exists, and then they can check to see when there are new episodes. Cool? So that brings us to what a podcast is, right? And so a podcast essentially, fundamentally, is audio content that's in an RSS feed, right? Today, of course, this word is used far more freely. We look at it as any show. So a majority of people that we talk to, they say that they consume podcasts on YouTube, which for podcast purists like me hurts a little bit, but it's okay. But ultimately, a podcast was meant to be audio content that was distributed through RSS. Today, of course, like I said, it's used in many different ways. Ultimately, any show tends to be called a podcast, and that's fine. I've made peace with it, so we're good. A brief mention here on something called the Podcast Index. Podcast Index is a directory of podcasts, right, all over the world. This is an open thing. It was started by one of the people I just mentioned, Adam Curry, with the idea of having a decentralized open index that was free until the end of time, ideally, just as a way of having a directory. So tomorrow, if you want to build a podcast app, which is the other thing that happens, right? If you want to build a podcast app, you can build your own app, query the directory, have a list of podcasts, and someone can listen in your player instead of Apple or Spotify or whatever. And according to the Podcast Index, there are 4 million podcasts today, right? That seems like a huge number. It's not as daunting as it sounds. But what it does tell you, though, is there's a lot of scope in the space, right? If you compare it, though, there are 51 million YouTube channels, right? And apparently, according to Google, 130 million books that have been published since the start of the printing press in 1917 or whenever. So there's still a lot of growth space that we can do here. But it's interesting to know that there are 4 million podcasts today around the world. Regionally, of course, that number is much tinier. So there's still an opportunity there. So as a brand, where do you start, right? It's one of two things. You either start a show or you advertise. What tends to happen a lot is people think of either one or the other, but you can do both, of course, right? And when you think of it from a brand perspective, you're thinking of starting a show is you think of it more as a communications thing, right? Which is you're actually creating content ultimately, right? So that flows under content strategy, and that's what you do with the brand, with the show, sorry. Whereas advertising is your traditional marketing, right? You leverage someone else's audience to advertise your product, your service, whatever. We'll talk more about both of these in a minute. So starting a show. So why would you start a show? I mean, you all are here, so let me hear from you. Why do you guys want to start a show? Do you guys want to know how to start a show? What's the deal? We're just 5 of us. We can run through. Can you give us your name too, please?
Starting a podcast was something I've been thinking about for a while. One of the biggest questions that I couldn't answer till now is when I start the show, what I'm going to talk about.
Yeah.
I know what I'm going to deliver. I know the service that I'm going to talk
Sure.
about, but in which context? Like communicating my thoughts or having someone to speak, interviewing a person. It's just how to begin. That's my basic question.
But an answer might come up in one of the slides that we're coming up with, but yeah, we'll see. Anybody else? Do you want to try? Go for it.
I'd love to do a show on gender equity, conversation with men, conversation with women.
Right, so yeah, I mean, when we look at starting a show, there are many different reasons why you might start one, obviously. You want to look at something that aligns with your brand, you want to try to find some synergy there. Let me share some examples first. Sorry, I'm having an issue with the clicker. One of the reasons people do that is to extend your community, right? So an example is the Lighthouse Conversations, a show we work on. The Lighthouse, this is the restaurant that's in D3 and Mall of the Emirates and so on. But they're essentially a restaurant and a concept store. So they sell art, gifting items, that kind of stuff, right? And what they want to be is they want to be a space where people come in, congregate, meet each other, connect with artists, connect with people and so on, right? And so what they started doing is they wanted to have conversations about art and food and sometimes technology and entrepreneurship and things of that nature. And so they started having these conversations in the restaurant, right? Which eventually became the podcast that we have today, which is now 3 years old and wonderful, and it's a really good show. You should check it out. But the idea is, again, it was done to extend their community, right? So they have the physical space, which is the different restaurants. They've got 5 branches today. But what about the ones who are either not in their restaurants? What about people who don't live here? How do we talk to them? How do we connect with them digitally, right? So that became the mission behind the show, to say how do we connect them, on what topics do we want to connect with? And that also frames, to some degree, how we have and what conversations we have as a result of that. You could add value, right? Sometimes you just want to add value to the conversation. This example we had with Volkswagen, where actually we don't mention any of their cars at all. We barely mention Volkswagen during the show, actually. Their idea was they wanted to just share stories of the community, inspiring stories of the community. That's all they wanted. They wanted to inspire. That was the mission statement, right? We want to inspire. We want to share the journey of interesting people. And so that's what we did, right? And so they built the show. It was a story of 2 entrepreneurs based in Dubai who had gone through significant things in their life, and they just wanted to share their story, what they learned from it, how they were inspired by it, and that's it. So sometimes all you're doing is you just want to add value, you want to give back. Of course, you can do that in other ways too. Sometimes you do it for education and awareness, right? So Book, for example, they're a sustainability company. They do a lot of sustainability consulting. They work with companies who want to do, who want to be more sustainable, right? And one of the challenges they were facing is people were just not aware what was happening in the sustainability space locally, right? And so they started a show, right? And so they said, we want to be able to create awareness for what's happening. We want to be able to connect people. And one of the biggest things that's happened as a result of the show actually is people have gotten connected with each other. So you listen to somebody that is doing something in food waste, if you're a restaurant, and you say, I want to partner with them because obviously it's someone local, it's someone I can be more sustainable with, right? So sometimes you do it for that, and that's been one of the drivers for the show as well. Sometimes it's just to do B2B updates. So this is something we've been doing recently, working with EVIC. EVIC is the electricity authority, one of the electricity corporations in Abu Dhabi, and they're using a podcast to do their quarterly updates, right? So sharing their updates, what's happening of course, in the electricity and water space, but with all of their stakeholders. So that includes internal people who are working on different things, as well as external people who are partnering with them, right? So they're working, for example, with Mediclinic and so on to transfer them to be 100% sustainable in terms of their energy. And so how do we communicate all these projects that are happening? How do we communicate the initiatives that are happening? Instead of writing long blog posts, we're doing it as a podcast, right? And on each episode, for example, we do a quarterly update that explains what's been going on for the last quarter. We also talk to the people who are driving some of the projects to get behind the scenes in terms of how the projects are being administered and so on. So there are a lot of things you can do with a podcast. There is no limitation, which is one of the advantages of being in the audio space. There really isn't, right? You don't have to look at this as only I have to now be a star show that talks to everybody. Sometimes you can have a very specific audience that says, we just want to talk to our stakeholders, but let's do it in a creative way. We're seeing it, not so much here, but we're seeing in other countries as well, people are using it to do internal comms, right? So instead of sharing updates that are going on within larger companies, you can do them as podcasts, right? 10-minute updates, that kind of thing. So the advantage is this, right? 92% of the people that we surveyed a couple of years ago locally in the region say they don't mind if the content's branded. They don't mind if a brand name is on a show, as long as the quality is good, of course, right? They just want to get value back from the show. They want to come back and listen to something that's valuable to them, right? Having a brand on the show does not have the same association as you might think of as an advertising, or you might think in other mediums where it is a bit trickier, right? Suddenly a brand is mentioned, or this is sponsored by somebody, and everybody kind of walks away from it. Podcasts have a lot of advantage in that space. In the region, only 30% of people actually listen to locally based shows. Most of the people listen to international ones. So again, when I was talking about that 4 million number in the beginning, there's a lot of opportunity here, right? But of course, people want to connect with things that are local. So if you produce something, there is gap in the space to actually go create something that could resonate with a local audience. 59% of Gen Z actually listens to podcasts for information, for answers, right? This is in addition to other surveys that imply that people consider podcasts to be very credible, right? Because you actually create a very intimate bond with the host, and if they trust you, you have a lot of credibility, right? This is a Spotify study, by the way, of Gen Z in the UAE alone, right? So today Gen Z is turning to podcasts for answers. Before they have conversations with family and friends, they're going to the podcast first. Anyway, so just to give you an idea there, what does that mean for you, right? When you're thinking of it from a content space, you have to start at your brand content pillars, which comes after your mission, of course, but what are the pillars that you have that you want to communicate on for your brand first? You have to start there, right? This is the exercise we do with anybody that we work with, is you start there. So to some degree, to your point, what do I talk about? You start here. Right? Once you've identified what it is, it's not just about the product or service. What are your brand's values? What it is that you want to connect with people on? Is it on sustainability? Is it on music? It could be anything, and that ranges wide. Is it on diversity? Right? Once you do that, then you translate that towards a show. Right? As opposed to starting with saying, I want to do a podcast because my brand should have a podcast, and then trying to work your way backwards to make something fit into the podcast space for you. And then the other side of it is that podcasts actually serve as a wonderful source of content. Once you've created a show, once you have an episode, once you have an interview, once you have whatever you have, you can now drive content to a lot of other platforms, right? So you can clip things out, put them on social, you have content for your newsletter, you have content for your website. This is actually where a lot of people kind of stumble as well. They create the podcast and then they expect everything to just start working. It doesn't work like that. But also importantly, you want to drive resonance for people who are working in multiple mediums, right? So you might have a lot of people who subscribe to your newsletter. If you don't tell them about your podcast there, that's going to be a problem. But more importantly, this content can be really easily repurposed, right? So when you look at social, you look at TikTok, for example, or Instagram or Reels and so on, a lot of our podcast content that gets generated is then clipped out 1 minute, 2 minute things that go out onto social. So again, that gives you content to put into your content funnel for marketing, as well as other things. Any questions about?
Yeah, I have.
Sure.
So you talked about the one where people are putting podcasts and they visuals onto YouTube, for example, which is controversial. So does that is that because they want to also tap into the whole video market side of it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, so the thing there is, of course, it's a consideration you have to make, right? Because a video production is obviously one level up and it takes more and you have to do a lot more work there as well. Cost is impacted as well, right? So doing a video show tends to be a bit trickier. So then what ends up happening, most of the conversations we have today is most brands want to do a podcast which is an audio conversation. But we use video for marketing and for socials and things like that because video plays better there. Right? So that's how we kind of use the two channels. We don't necessarily do the entire interview on YouTube, but we may release a 5-minute clip or a 2-minute clip that's relevant, right? Ultimately, you want to think sort of multi-channel, and you want to see how you can fit things into a different space. So that's kind of where you start, right? So essentially that's my first tip, which kind of comes down to understand what that purpose is, right? Whether you call it a brand mission, whether you call it your own personal mission, which I shared with you when I started this conversation, ultimately understand your purpose. If you don't start there, most likely the show won't last very long, right? Because you don't have something to fall back on when you run out of topics or you run out of things, right? And it also helps guide you or guide the brand when you do a longer term plan for your show, right? So once you discover that, look, ultimately I want to talk about sustainability, or I want to talk about sustainable things, it gives you a place to go back to when, let's say, you want to look for a new guest, you're looking for new topics, because over time, of course, these things will change. You can't be talking about the same thing over and over again. So you want to come back to that purpose to say, okay, is what I'm going to do next driving back that purpose for me or not? This is an example that, to just illustrate the same point anyway. This is a conversation we had with the founder of Canvas Gelato. I don't know if you guys know, but lovely, lovely ice cream and gelato company. He came on the show and essentially he said this, he said, what this platform has highlighted, which is the show, is that everybody has issues, but ultimately it's a journey, and it's a journey of growth. What's interesting about that for us, this is an interview we did about 3 or 4 months ago, so the show had been on for about 2.5 years. This was in our mission statement when we wrote the purpose document for the show. That's what we had written down, is that we want to explore the journey of people, and we want to get to know them, and we know that everybody has issues. We don't want to just talk about destinations, we want to talk about the whole journey, right? And because that show is so ideologically driven in delivering that passion or whatever, it was just interesting for him to come back, and he essentially read back our mission statement back to us, right? 2.5 years later, saying, I've heard all your episodes, this is what I'm getting out of the show, right? And ultimately that's that connection you want to create. So let's talk quickly about advertising, because you're not limited to only creating a show. You can also advertise on existing shows, leverage existing audiences, which is the next point, right? Sometimes you have audiences that are overlapping with your own, just like you would advertise on social media, just like you would advertise on YouTube or wherever. You can also advertise on podcasts, right? And it's also a nice tester into seeing if this is something you want to do in the audio space, right? Again, you have to work a little creatively in terms of how you create the audio and what you do with the ad and how you work with the person. But the idea is you can actually leverage this as a way of doing pure marketing now, actually running a lead generation campaign, for example, with something like, with somebody's podcast, and seeing what that does for you. So it's a nice example we've done recently. Sadik is a real estate company that's based in Egypt, who are partnered with our show called What I Did Next. And essentially what we did is we actually interviewed the residents who were living in their properties about why they wanted to be there, or why they picked the property, why they bought the property, and so on. And the idea again was to just drive back the brand's mission back to them, right? And instead of reading out an ad that says, Sadik is amazing and they have so many properties and there are 7 different things they do, it was just nicer if it came and more authentic if it came from the residents who are actually living there. Of course, this takes a little bit more work, but that's why we're here, right? The idea is to do that. So obviously we filter through the residents. We want to make sure that they are actually living there and so on and so on. So obviously we went through that exercise, but they have really nice things to say about living in the properties that Sadik has. So why not use that, right? So there are a lot of creative things you can do. Of course, this ran as a multimedia campaign, so we also have videos that have gone out on social in terms of the campaign. But you can be very creative. It's not just because it's an audio, you send a few talking points and then that's all you hear, right? So you can do creative things in the advertising space as well. And advertising on podcasts has a lot of resonance, right? And I'll explain why in a minute, but this is a study that was done by the BBC a couple of years ago, where they compared the same ad run on TV versus run on a podcast, and they see upwards of 20% better recall rates on a podcast, right? And that's because podcasts are both passive but very, very intimate, right? Unlike TV, which is generally tends to be a communal thing most of the time, podcasts are generally heard in headphones by someone while they're working out or whatever, in a car while they're driving and spending long hours, right? So there's a lot of intimacy in podcasting. And it's important to recognize that, understand that, and see how you can leverage that, right? It's also passive. So 90% of the people that listen to podcasts are actually doing something else while they listen, right? This is important to know, because if you're going to do a massive data dump for 3 minutes, most of your information is not going to be retained, right? But it's lovely, right? You can do them while you can listen to something and get information while you're doing dishes, which is my favorite way to listen to a podcast because I hate doing the dishes. But But most people, 90% of the people, listen while they're doing something else. Which brings me to my second tip. Understand the medium that you're in, right? This is, by the way, advice I would give anybody doing anything, right? So this is true for Instagram, this is true for TikTok, this is true for YouTube, this is true for everything. I understand the convenience, and there is merit to just saying I'm going to do it once and publish it everywhere, right? And that's fine when you're starting out, but it's important to understand and leverage the medium you're in. So again, the example I was just saying, if you go around and give 5 different data points of why sustainability is the best thing on the planet, while someone's doing their dishes, they're probably not going to hear 3 of those stats. More importantly, they're not going to remember it. So you kind of want to lace that carefully, do that carefully. You can also take advantage of the fact that you know you're in their ear. One of the things that we tell people when we're creating shows, talk to the individual. Not you guys, not all of you, talk to you, right? It's about understanding the medium you're in and leveraging that as much as you can. That's tip 2, so I'm going to stop for a second. Any questions? There is a question. Excellent. Yes, but I mean, so it also depends, right? So for example, if you're driving and you're following directions, or not following directions, if you're driving, you find that if you're driving to the same route every day, your muscle memory is in place. You can actually consume things laterally. If you're going to a new location, I would not recommend you listen because you're probably not going to remember anything, right? If you're trying to navigate a difficult thing, I mean, I'm sure you've noticed that as just as a behavior. You're driving to a new location, you start switching things off because it's distracting you. But you drive to the same route every single day, you have the music blasting as loud as you can, or a podcast or whatever, because you don't mind, because you can consume. So a lot of that is muscle memory. If you're doing things like dishes and stuff, of course, I don't need to be focused there. The other side of it, of course, is audio has an advantage over video, which is I don't need your attention. I actually don't want it, right? So I can be in places that video can't be, like the dishes. It's hard to be looking at something else while you're trying to do the dishes. But I don't need your eyes, I just need your ear. So an example of this, anyways, is we've done a partnership with, I don't know what's happening over there, but anyway, we've done a partnership with the local radio station here called Top 100.3, where we're combining podcasts and the radio together, right? Because ultimately we're both on audio, so why not, right? And again, a part of this partnership is just because we say, well, we look at audio as a medium, how can we leverage that better, right? And so there's a space that we don't play in, which is radio, so how can we create together? One last thing on advertising as well is podcasts generally run on something called dynamic ad insertion. So we use this as a way of creating timely resonance as well, right? So for example, had we advertised this event on a podcast, let's say, then until yesterday, you would have heard the ad that said, this event's happening tomorrow. And then today you would stop hearing the ad because the event's already done. Technology enables us to do that, where we can actually program how we run our ads. So again, this is something you can leverage, right? If you have a product launch, if you have something, you can run the campaign for longer, but run timely messaging around events, around things, right? So we use this quite a lot, actually. And we use this even for content sometimes, right? If we want to announce something related to the show that has a finite time frame, we run it only for that duration, and then it just gets clipped out of the audio automatically.
How is it different from like Instagram algorithms, which would be like based on my the things that I'm browsing is how I get ads? Is it the same thing?
No, it's different ends, right? So you're talking about the consumer side, right? Which is where how do I receive an ad? I receive an ad based on my preferences, what I've liked, what I haven't liked. This is on the publisher side, right? It says, I want to communicate a message to you. You're already a follower of the show. I want to communicate a message to you that is timely, right? So I only want to run it for a certain amount of time with you. And so the advantage there is, again, you can do timely messaging around events, launches, and things like that. So if you're an advertiser, you want to leverage that, right? You can do this is what we do with most advertisers, is we have a general message that is a brand awareness message or a product awareness message, for example. But then around specific launches or specific events and things that might be happening, we'll run a campaign for a little while, for a week, 2 weeks, and then swap it back out. I figured I should talk about why I'm here and what my value is. So I put in this slide for you. But essentially, the question is, do you need a producer, right? Part of the reason you need a producer is all the stuff I just mentioned, right? Which is there's a lot of things to take into consideration, a lot of things to put together. And sometimes it starts from translating what is your brand and how is that going to come off as a podcast, to actually doing the work. So as you would do, for example, with a social media agency who is more up to date than you are, and in terms of what's happening and what's not, and what you can leverage and what's not, whether it's expertise, whether it's production expertise as well. But a lot of it is content, right? A lot of it is actually helping with the content. So that's what we do all the time when we work with brands, is we actually translate what is your idea and how do we translate that into something that could be relevant as a show, right? And then that's an ongoing effort as well, right? In terms of who are the guests, how do we select them, do they align with what, it's about keeping you guys on point.
It's not just production, you do creative strategy as well.
Absolutely, yeah. A producer, so this is the producer role that podcasts are going to have come from radio.
But how would they be different? Like the creative strategy role and what you would do there and what you would do as a producer? How would that, like, can you explain those?
Yeah, so again, like I said, a producer role which comes from radio essentially is about the content that is going on air, right? And so it's about who's coming on, how are we interviewing, what's happening after the interview is done, what parts we're keeping, what the edit process and all of that. The raw production process, the editing, publishing. The raw production process that we know or we're talking about generally is actually miking the person up and actually running the production, which these guys are doing over there, right? That's the pure production, right? But what a producer does in terms of a content producer or a radio producer, podcast producer, whatever, is the stuff that comes just before and just after that, right? So it's about actually aligning you, making sure you're ready for, sometimes it's research, sometimes it's what are the questions we want to ask, how do we make sure we're staying on point with what is it that we want to deliver on the episode, and sometimes after, where a lot of our conversations are, man, all of this was relevant, it didn't add anything, let's take it out, that kind of stuff. From a content and creative strategy point, of course, that's where I help brands as well, but that's a completely different role. But that is an initial, mostly an initial work that we do, right, where we actually sit down and work out what is the brand, what is the show going to look like. So of course there's ongoing activity that happens around that. The majority day-to-day stuff is you need a producer who can be your right-hand person in terms of just getting your show out the door and keeping you on point. As an entrepreneur, as a brand leader, you will have other things to worry about, right? So you need someone who can keep you on point. That's where we do it. Of course, smaller independent shows, you can absolutely, the advantage of podcasts is absolutely one-man show can absolutely produce a podcast and become a gigantic hit, no question. There are tons of examples of those. And to some degree, that's how I started, right?
So because would you recommend a marketing person to be the producer for these kind of podcasts?
Well,
Understand the content and the strategy of the company.
yeah, so you need to have your marketing team aligned when we're doing this. The podcast producer tends to be an external person unless you're a media publishing house and you hire someone internal to become the podcast producer role, right? Because there are aspects of podcasting that they need to know as well. But when you're looking at a branded show, which is the example we're thinking of, generally that podcast producer is someone like me, right? Where we come in to do that work, to align with you, and then either deliver the show or not, depending on the different arrangements that we have. But having the marketing person in the room is very important. Most of the time what happens is the entrepreneur or the founder tends to have a very clear idea of what their brand is, so it's about translation. But as I mentioned in the beginning as well, if you don't have that done, there's very little I can do with you, right? Because it becomes then, we're starting a show, and let's see, we'll throw a few things and let's see if it sticks, right? Which is not great from a brand point of view. Coming back to the 4 million thing. So 4 million podcasts, but 18% have produced an episode in the last 90 days. That's, again, as I mentioned, that's why that number might seem daunting, but the reality of it is, today you can start a really good show, be super consistent, and grow your audience over 6 months to a year without hesitation, right? Because a lot of people start a show, do 1-2 episodes, and then drop off.
Based on your experience, what are the kind of frequencies that you would suggest is the best example of how a brand can do in a podcast? The frequency, how often, the length, what are you seeing?
There's a subjective answer to that. There isn't a one size fits all, and there shouldn't be, right? So the idea is you want to kind of figure out for the brand what works best. It also sometimes depends on time commitments. We're actually going to require someone from the company to sit and do the interviews, for example, or a couple of people or whatever. And sometimes it is hard to say, let's do a weekly show, which is what we generally find. That's a heavy time commitment, because it's also not just before, it's also after. Someone has to sit and listen to the stuff we produce, approve it. There's a process, right? So most of the time, most people, they do it every other week. That's a good level of resonance to do. But twice a month generally is a good place to start. If you can ramp it up, wonderful, you should do it. Anything shorter than that tends to be a little bit out of sight, out of mind in today's content world anyway, where there's so much information getting thrown at somebody. It's a bit trickier. But as an example, the example I showed you with EWIC, where it's actually quarterly updates, we started out doing once a quarter, right? We're now moving to monthly, and then, which I think is a good frequency for them. So a lot of this is subjective for the brand.
Is there a relationship between the amount of time of the show? For example, because a 10-minute show was 30-minute show, it's a 40-minute show, and how often you should produce it in terms of like?
To some degree, yes. I mean, there is a correlation for a couple of reasons. One is a 1-hour show means the person who might be interviewing, I need them for 3 hours at a minimum on the day, plus they need to spend 1 or 2 hours afterwards listening to an hour-long thing, right? So the time commitment is exponential compared to a 10-minute show, right? So automatically it's easier to produce that more frequently from a production side. From a consumption side as well, if I'm only putting out 10-minute pieces of content, I can do that more frequently because I'm not worried about overloading the person who's listening with my messaging and or whatever, right? But if I were doing a longer show, which today's audience is not necessarily the biggest fan of, then I would do it slightly less frequently.
Are there 10-minute podcasts?
There are tons of them. No.
That was the same thing I wanted to ask about the video. So, there was a recent article saying that there is no more tendency for shorter podcasts. So rather than longer ones, they're easier to digest, more for the listener, and it's just the direct thing that they will get the answer without listening to a lot of before and after. So, do you see this as a good way to start, like to start with shorter length episodes rather than longer ones, even if the content is like that rich?
My answer is going to be the same thing that I mentioned a few minutes ago, which is you never start there, right? You always start with what is it that you want to deliver first, right? And the reason for that is, to use the example of the Lighthouse conversations, we started out as a 30-minute show, today it's a 45-minute show. We've actually taken the time up, not down. And the reason for that is because today we have an audience that comes for the show. They like the interviewer, they like the guests we're bringing on, they'll stick around, right? And there's more to say, right? As time passes, we have more things to add to the conversation about art and culture and food. So a lot of it depends on really what you're trying to deliver, and I would start there. Yes, 100%, the data today says there is an appetite for shorter shows, but this is not limited to podcasting. This is everything, right? Today we are a TikTok world that is looking for 1 minute. Actually, we're not even willing to go to 1 minute. We're just 15 minutes, we make a decision, we move on, right? So the appetite is there. But as you grow your audience, it doesn't have to be limited. But I would start again so I'll give you an example of a show. We haven't released it yet, obviously, so I can't tell you more about it. But we started by saying, okay, we want to do a short show. We want to keep it short and sweet. But you need 20 minutes just to establish some context. You need 5-10 minutes to establish some of the terms. I mean, I've been talking to you now for 45 minutes. And all I've done is establish context for why you should podcast. Because it takes a while to set that up. And so if the content you have, so the example you were saying about diversity and equity, right? There are so many studies. You will want to showcase what is the state of the world today, where do we want to go. It's going to take you some time to do that. And if you stop there or stop midway, you're actually not going to create a nice experience. So maybe you are looking at 20 minutes or 30 minutes as opposed to 10. But if you're a marketing show, again, I'm just throwing an example here, but you're a marketing show, for example, and you want to give one marketing tip away every episode, you could get away with doing it in 5. So again, you start, what is it that you want to deliver, and then find some kind of resonance as to how long it would take you to deliver that.
But there must be like some absolute standard. Don't go beyond this time, or don't do anything less than this time.
One of the most popular shows in the world is Joe Rogan. His episode is 3.5 hours long. And I promise you, people listen. They just listen in parts. They listen one way and then continue back and listen other ways. When there is an appetite, people will listen, right? When people come for that, they will listen, right? Again, but he has millions of people listening to the 3-hour. He also has millions of people listening to the 10-minute clips, right? There's an appetite for both. So again, you would start there. There isn't no don'ts other than what I would say is in the region. If you go too often above a minute, especially when you're starting out, it's going to be harder, right? Because today there is a daunting element when someone sees 60 minutes, I have to give away, right? And most commutes, we link it to commutes, right? Most commutes here are 20 minutes, 30 minutes generally. So if you're in that range, you can finish an episode in a commute. So you think like that. So yeah, I would not recommend necessarily going above an hour. It's very rare even we publish anything that's more than an hour long. If it goes that far, we split into 2 parts and say these are 2 half-hour parts. Sorry, you had a question.
I have a question. For example, if I'm a new beginner of podcasting, what would be the best platform to start to distribute my information? If it's regarding IT company, startup IT company, and what platform would you suggest to distribute the information as a podcast?
So two parts to that question, right? So first is how do you distribute the podcast? You go to Apple Podcast, Spotify, and so on, right? This is the standard way you would do it. So you obviously will create it, set up the RSS feed in a hosting platform, and then send it out, right? But the step that comes after that, of course, is where is your audience, right? Because if you want to bring them into a podcast, you're going to find out where they are, right? Today, a lot of that world is Instagram and TikTok, and so we use that as ways to funnel people back to the podcast. And so that's the distribution part that you have to think about. In your case, it might be newsletters, right? So for example, they're mostly reading newsletters and updates. So maybe you will look to partner with people who send out newsletters to that audience and say, can we get my show on there? Or can you link back to my show? Whatever that arrangement might be, that's how you would market it out, right? 100%. I mean, and a lot of it is also, again, let's use your example, right? Most IT managers, are they actually listening to podcasts? Maybe not, right? Maybe they are, maybe not, right? We actually here in this region, we get a lot of people who come and listen on our website, right? They actually prefer to come in, hit play, no commitment, and walk away. Come back again, check if there's something new, hit play when they have some time and they do it. And I hear from a lot of people who just say, yeah, listen to the show on your website.
Or hit play while they're working, so it's in the background.
It's in the background and stuff, but they don't necessarily are not in the loop of saying I'm on Apple Podcasts and I'm subscribing to a show and stuff. Yeah, I'd love for them to do that, and that's part of the funnel that we try and create for them. But ultimately, we have to start where they are, right? Even if you want to announce, I mean, I'm sure you've seen this a lot, right? A lot of people will post on Instagram that they are now on TikTok. So why do they do that? They do that because their audience is on Instagram, and they want them to know that you're there. So that's how you would start. Which brings to point 3, which is plan, right? Starting a show without understanding the purpose, without understanding the medium, and without a plan probably won't go so well, right? We generally start out with long-term plans as much as we can. So we start with that mission, as I explained, try and map out what some of the episodes are going to look like, who the people are going to be, because we don't live in a world where you can record something and release it the next day, right? Especially if you're doing something that is aligning with your brand. You may want to consider it, you may want to think about how you're going to market it. There's a lot of stuff to do there, right? So yes, it is possible today to record on your phone and release something a minute later, 100%. But when you're doing it for a brand, would you want to do it that way? Probably not, right? There is TikTok and Instagram and stuff, you would leverage those channels for those things. But if you're doing deeper conversations, you want to be considerate about it. You want to think it through. You want to align with a longer term plan to say, who's going to be episode 10? Do I have enough? Have I created something that has enough content that can get me to episode 10? Right? A lot of people find, I'll interview entrepreneurs. Great. They do 5, and then I've run out of entrepreneurs in my circle. What do I do next? Right? And that's why it's so important to kind of think through how you plan. What is it you want to do? Do you want to do a season? Do you want to do 5 seasons? Right? Do you want something that's ongoing? You want to do 2 episodes a month for a while, right? And if that's the case, you're going to need to have content in your bank, right? Because the things will come up as you do stuff, right? So it's important, very, very important to plan. And part of the reason why you need a producer, because we do the planning, right? We take all of the stuff in, and we start chalking out plans to help and say, okay, we need to be here so that we can release this way, that way, whatever. So coming to the end of it, just a quick note on Web 3.0 because I feel like it's important. I'm sure you all have heard about this. Since you nodded very happily, what is Web 3.0? Since you nodded very happily, tell me what is Web 3.0?
Web 3.0 actually there was an event over here as well of Web 3.0. So like 3.0 is kind of like an upgraded version of Web 2.0 where like privacy and data is very important that people have more control of the data of what they have.
Yeah, so I mean, we look at Web 1, which was essentially simple websites, Web 2, social media, and the larger ecosystem. Web 3 is sort of a mixture of the two, but in better ways, right? So ultimately, it's the idea of decentralizing the internet to some degree, giving ownership back to creators primarily, but of course, as a result, brands and other people as well. There's a lot to be talked about in terms of blockchain and all that. I'm not going to get into that today, but I just want to kind of hint that, podcast, as I mentioned when I opened this, it's one of the last decentralized content spaces that we have. Blogs are not really a thing anymore, but podcasting still is, right? Nobody owns it. You can publish anywhere. Your listeners can consume it anywhere, right? And so it's a natural fit. And going back to the podcast index, their idea was to try and see, can we bridge this gap? Can we create an open space for the future for podcasting down the road that's integrated, that keeps the ownership with the creators? One of the things, as an example, Apple used to run the primary podcasting directory in the world until a few years ago, right? They always kept it open, they always kept it free. I have no reason to doubt that Apple is going to turn that off tomorrow, but the idea was, what if they did? The entire ecosystem of podcasting would struggle because all the players look at that index for what shows are there and what's new and what's not, right? So their idea was to say we should be independent from that, create an independent index. So today you can set up a new podcast app that talks just to this index and not touch Apple at all, which was the point. But they also went on to expand the RSS stuff, which is what I was talking to you about in the beginning, right? Is how can we now add more functionality to podcasting? So an example is we're adding location to podcasts now, which means if the podcast is about a location, we tag that in our feed. And if you're listening in one of the apps that support it, of course not all apps do yet, but if you're listening in one of the apps supported, you could actually search and say, show me podcasts about Karama, about Dubai, about London, about where I'm going, or just because I have an interest in the space, right? It's about extending that and creating the next wave of stuff. One of this is something called the value block. The idea is, can we create a way for payments to creators directly from the listeners, right? As opposed to doing it via a platform and having a PayPal or whatever in the middle. So today, actually, you can do this if you have some Bitcoin. You can actually pay me while you listen to a podcast, right? This is its early stages, of course, it's just an example, but the idea is today, podcasts are actually leveraging the blockchain. So you can actually, you have to be in one of the new apps. You can actually, as you can see at the bottom, sats are, by the way, they're 100 millionth of a Bitcoin, so it's a small currency. You can actually, as you listen, give me back the value you feel like I should get for doing the show, right? This is live, yeah, this is a screenshot from the app. So our original shows are all on there, but of course this is not a full, well-formed ecosystem yet, so this is still in the works. But the idea is you can do it in multiple ways. So if you find that I've given you some really good advice, you can send me, I don't know, a couple hundred Satoshis just because. But you can also stream per minute, so for every minute of audio you listen, you keep sending me something back. And because they deal in very, very small currencies, it's actually quite a fun experience as well. You're actually not giving a lot away because most people at the end of it, you've given me maybe $1, not even, sometimes 50 cents. But it's an interesting kind of approach to saying, how do we take podcasting into the new world? It's by streaming Satoshis. Which brings to the concept of value for value, which is what the podcast index is built on, is ideally, give me back the value you felt you got out of this, right? And it's just turning that around on the head a little bit to say, give me $5 as a tip for a coffee or whatever, as we do today, saying, give me back what you felt you got as value from this. What's interesting, in the stuff, obviously most of these examples are from the US. It's interesting how people respond to that compared to when I set a limit and say, give me $1. Because when I say, give me $1, you're going to give me $1. When I say, give me value, you might give me more. Or less. And that's fine. If you felt that, by the way, it's a very good indicator, right? Because if I tell you, give me $1 because you feel like supporting me, you're going to give me $1, it doesn't tell me a lot. It tells me, yeah, you like my content, that's about it. But if I tell you, give me the value, and all of you give me only half a cent, maybe I should do something about my content, right? But if some of you are boosting me $10, then maybe it's resonating well. It's an interesting indicator. Anyway. Finally, a quick note on the Podcast Academy. So if you're interested in, the Podcast Academy essentially is similar to, well, I have to work backwards. So you know the Oscars. The Oscars is actually run by something called the Motion Pictures Academy, right? So it's not actually called the Oscars. This is a similar model that, well, some people are trying to create and I'm a part of now, which is essentially to create an organization, a professional organization for podcasters. We have an award called the Ambies for ambient sound. that happens every year. Last year there was actually a red carpet, which was fun. I'm hoping to attend next year. The idea of just providing, recognizing excellence in audio, just purely for podcasting. But they also do a lot of workshops, master classes around how to create good shows, a lot of which are free for members, and sometimes it's free in general as well. No, it's a US-based organization, but I'm a local governor now, and we're trying to expand it out here as well. So that's it. That's everything I have to say today. You can find out more, Amaeya.media. We're on Instagram as well, and Twitter and other things. But yeah, that's it. I'm happy to take more questions if you guys have any, or talk to you about your ideas as well. Yeah.
Just talk us through very quickly on the process that you go through when you want to encourage to plan and produce what are the different I mean, I know you've run through most of it here.
I'll do a full. Okay, cool. So it's going to be a longer answer, so let me try and get this question first.
One on the ways that people learn. So you have your audio, you have your visual, you have your interactive. I think I read somewhere that 25% roughly of the population are audio learners.
On what, sorry?
25% of the population are actually audio learners.
Audio learners, okay, yeah.
So you mentioned it's like the YouTube videos, not technically a podcast. So it's solely audio, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, that was just me sort of explaining the technical definition, but today I know a lot of people, they think of podcasts as what they see on YouTube as well. It's fine. Like I said, I've made peace with that definition. But that's not the point anyway. I mean, the idea is audio is a very great medium to learn. I mean, the Spotify example that I gave you where they did a study of Gen Z in the UAE, where a lot of them are using podcasts as a way to learn more information. Yeah, Udemy and other places as well, yeah.
But then like coupling that with like maybe the visual version of it as well, like you mentioned this like spread across more as many mediums as possible to leverage like its value, right? To go where the customer is. Like the idea behind it is like to still reach your users even if they don't necessarily just like your audio.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, look, the question, of course, is as a brand or as a company and stuff, you have limited resources, limited time, limited money, and you kind of want to channel that correctly at the end of the day, right? So the idea is you start with the podcast. The way we look at it when we're doing shows is the podcast is sort of the long form. That might be 30-minute, 40-minute interview. And then we do shorter clips that might go out to, let's say, a TikTok or a Reel, or even or even YouTube, for example, where we put up 5-minute clips of what's happening, right? But when you're looking at it from an from an audience resonance point of view, yeah, you look at where your audience is and try to hit those channels first. Again, it's a priority thing, right? But there's nothing to say that if you were only audio, which by the way, most of our shows are only in audio. We don't even film them, right? So for example, the EVIC one I gave you is a good example. We're not even filming them because that's not the priority for us. That's not the priority for them either. And we deliver the information only in audio. So this is not to say that you can't do it only in audio, but from a marketing standpoint of creating awareness for your show, you may need to leverage other channels. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Sorry, you were mentioning the process in terms of doing that? Yeah.
Like when you break it down, you have your first meeting with the client who wants to say, use you as a I know you talk about purpose and plan and everything. How do you break down the different steps with them to be able to set up a podcast?
I mean,
Like a briefing document.
yeah, we do. Thank you. Yeah, look, I mean,
Like step by step, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things that, as I mentioned, I mean, generally, if we're going to be working with the client, we actually start with their content plan or their content brief. Yeah, what is their content brief? If they have one for the podcast, that's great. If they don't, that's fine. But understanding really what is the brand looking to communicate on is where we need to start for us generally. So we start taking that and looking at that and saying, okay, are there ideas you actually have? What is it that you want to do? Sometimes what happens is they have an idea to say, we do want to be in a podcast space, we don't know what to do with it yet. In some cases, we have identified a few people we want to talk to, but we still don't know what the overlying umbrella is. So it's about just getting all that information from them first and kind of we parse through a little bit of that and try and understand, okay, I think if we talk about this is where the idea is to keep delivering brand resonance at the end of the day especially for brand shows, right? And that could be a personal brand as well, but you want to kind of keep going back to some of the things that you're doing. So that's what we kind of look to start building out first to say, okay, what is that? We do have a simple briefing document where I call it a brain dump anyways. I'll send you a very outlined document. Sure, yeah, and it's just you just fill it out and you send it back to me. That's actually where we start most of our conversations. So if you fill it out and send it to me, then I can have a conversation with you because I understand, at least I get a sense of what it is that you're trying to do. Thankfully, I'm good at parsing through a lot of information. But that's where you start. And then once we come to that, then we start looking at saying, okay, what is that going to mean in terms of a show? What are we actually going to do? How often do we feel like we can do it? And these are, as I mentioned, there's a lot of decisions in that process of how much time commitment do they have, what the budget is, of course, in terms of how often they want to produce. Do they want to go?
Writing the script and stuff, like basically, like if let's say I want to talk about gender, and I did the brain dump and I said, okay, we arrived at fundamentally the audience we want to speak to are women and men, and fundamentally I like to do it once a month, like you.
Whatever, yeah, we've worked out those steps, yeah.
And what happens next? Like, would production also take care of?
Yeah, producer actually does do that, right? So generally a producer will we tend to write the scripts because we're working through the episode anyway. We generally do the script writing anyway. It's what happens, and then in most cases actually that's what runs. But in some cases, of course, if the entrepreneur or brand is more interested, they come in and say, okay, I want to change it a little bit more to my voice, and that's a process that is quite a bit organic because over time we also learn the kind of voice and the kind of tone that they want to have, and then of course we adapt what we do for that. But that's, I mean, that is really like, that's a production plus step, right, for us. All of this stuff happens even before we even record the first interview, because it is important for us to understand where we are going with this, especially when we're doing it for a brand, because otherwise you're kind of shooting in the dark, really, in terms of like, who are we targeting, why is this guest a fit for us, right? It's very easy to get carried away in saying, well, this is a big guy, if he shares my show, I'll get a lot of people, right? It's very easy to do that, and you do, by the way, it works, right? You do get the advantage, but the problem is they're coming for him or her, they're coming for the stuff they talk about, not necessarily what you talk about. So we also see a drop off afterwards. We're like, I don't know why I'm following this show, they don't actually talk to me, right? And so it's very important to kind of go through that exercise. I mean, that's what we do. We spend a few months sometimes, depending on how refined the idea is. Then we get into a production, like we actually start recording because there is a tonal element to podcasting, of course. As I mentioned, it is very intimate, it's in your ear, and it has to align with your brand, right? So if your brand is casual, talking to Gen Z and stuff, it's very different from EVIC, where we're talking to stakeholders of energy sector in Mediclinic, right? It's a very different, the tone of the show is very different, right? It's very formal. We do help with that. I mean, of course, the speech therapy is a very different sort of expertise. This is my teacher tone. That's why. No, I'm just kidding. No, we do that, and what happens with time as well is you get better. So we try to set the expectations a little bit that way to say you're not going to be the master interviewer you think you might be on day one, and that's fine. It's a process. Well, obviously, because we're in the room generally, so the producer is always, the producer role, by the way, is always in the room with you. So no matter who you hear on our shows, I'm actually almost every episode, I'm sitting there in the background, quietly, obviously. In terms of sometimes where it's like, you get through an entire interview and you're like, we kind of didn't hit, you guys talked a lot, but you actually didn't hit on the stuff that we had to talk about, so let's go get that answer, right? Or sometimes within the room, we already know that this interview isn't going to air because it hasn't worked out the way we wanted to, and so on. So there's a lot of stuff that happens in that process, of course, right? And then, of course, once we distribute, to just complete that, we also help now with marketing strategy of the show as well, right? So to her point as well, where it's like, how do we market this? How do we grow the audience for that, right? And some of it happens within the podcast space, but some of it happens outside the podcast space, right? In terms of saying, maybe there are newsletters we need to hit. I mean, now we work with agencies who help create the branding, create the content, the clips, and all of that stuff that happens after the fact to help create the best resonance we can for a show and grow it within the audience we want.
So one question would be, I'm coming from the PR point of view, right? Because we do a lot of that. So when we do PR training or spokesperson training for our speakers for different companies, different brands, we have very clear, defined who's endorsed. When it comes to broadcast, the speakers may not always be speaker trained. So are there a couple of sort of pointers that we should tell speakers before we bring them onto a podcast?
So if you're a PR person advising someone who's about to come onto a podcast, is that the question? If you're a PR person advising someone who's about to come on a podcast, is that the question?
We're not sure whether, what they need to be considered before they come on.
Yeah, so the correct, the ideal answer to that question is actually you should have received something from the podcast in terms of what's the point, why we're bringing them on, and we generally do communicate that with the guest to say, look, we want you here for this. A lot of it depends on the tone of the show. So, for example, the Lighthouse, it's a conversation show. The show is about the conversation. We have some starting talking points that we want to talk to you about X or Y, with your journey, for example, but we don't necessarily go in with a strict script because the idea is, and a lot of stuff happens during the interview, right? The interviewer will ask follow-up questions and kind of do that. But for example, with the show with EWIC, it's a very heavily scripted. When I say heavily scripted, I mean it's very heavily defined. What is going to be said, what's not going to be said, right? Because we're doing corporate updates for a public company, and we have very strict guidelines around some of that. So a lot of it does depend on the show. Podcasts are somewhere, I would say, between proper PR and like a TikTok, right? Like we're somewhere in between that space, right? So we're not necessarily super speaker trained. In fact, you will find, and most of my hosts will agree with that, is they actually don't like people who are overly speaker trained because it becomes very stiff of a conversation. And the thing about audio, again, is you hear that. You can hear the person not being genuine most of the time, right? There are studies that show why and stuff, we don't need to get into that, but we have resonance with sound, even more so than, if you're watching a YouTube video, you can actually be distracted by the visual. You can be distracted by me doing this right now and think that I'm a fun speaker. I might be not saying necessarily anything interesting, right? But in audio, I can't distract you with anything. For me, the best parallel is like a book, right? It's, the words are mine, but the imagination's yours, right? You can imagine me in any shirt you want while I'm talking, right? You could think I could be wearing bright pink, and you can think I'd be wearing dull black, right? It doesn't matter. So the idea is that you want it to be authentic. If you're coming on specifically to share updates that you've done, so for example, if the reason I'm bringing you on is because you've announced a funding round or you've announced whatever it might be, then of course, the more pointers you give them, the better equipped they are to answer the questions that I want to get out of it, right? But again, you want the conversation to be a little more authentic and genuine. Most podcasts are not fussed about someone coming back and saying, "Man, I shouldn't have said something. Can we do something about that?" Again, depends. Those are editorial decisions, but we're not after that. And so there's a lot of, I wouldn't, like I said, we generally don't prefer people who are overly speaker trained because those conversations just don't sound genuine. Any other questions?
Have you seen success in podcasts that are like blogs or journals of someone's life? You see a lot of always conversation of like, is there ever any successful ones where it's literally someone just using it as a record keeping for their journey?
Yeah, it's a little bit more in the, you see examples of these in the US and UK and stuff. I haven't seen a lot of that here. I don't see why it wouldn't work, but it again depends on the audience that you're trying to cultivate. If you want one, you might not. We've spoken to a lot of people who would like to do things like that, right? So there are a lot of people who have, for example, gone through a journey, whether it's in healing or something like that, and they kind of want to share their experience of it, and it's a one-man talk to mic kind of thing. I think that works in certain contexts. I don't think it's not doable. There are a lot of examples in the US where both single-person shows like that, but also conversations. So it could be you and a friend talking about something specific, so that it doesn't sound like a monologue for too long anyway.
Are those, so like when you think of like this most successful, it's hard to generalize, right?
Yeah.
The purpose and so on, but do you think of just what you've seen in the market, what would be like the approach they will take, and also maybe like the average time of podcast episode that's been popular?
So again, like I said, I mean the average, what most listeners prefer is something that's 30 minutes under. That's generally what people in the region generally prefer. Like I said, it has to do with commute times, it has to do with just attention spans and not dumping an hour worth of content at me. If you're doing it as a monologue, I would go shorter, because if you're just going to talk for 30 minutes, I'm going to tune it out over time, or a listener, I mean not me necessarily, but a listener will tune it out over time because it just sounds one-dimensional. So a conversation always tends to work better, but you can do it shorter. So where we've done odd examples of it's a one person talking to mic, we generally keep it to 10 or 15 minute stops, just because that's what you can grasp. But if you're doing, like you said, if you're doing a journal, you're doing it with a friend, and you're discussing experiences, whatever those are, you can go a bit longer, of course.
What's the average post time, like
I don't think there's a fixed number there, honestly. But like I said, I would go weekly or every other week generally, because that's the best way to build the audience, because you want to keep having new stuff to go to, right? For me, once a month, especially if you're doing a show that's a bit personal or whatever, you kind of, it's an you only have once a month that you can go to people and say, I've got something new to give you. I think that tends to be, it's a harder journey in terms of if the goal is to really grow an audience and create something bigger.
Last question, sorry. From a business perspective, has the podcast as a medium been studied on like clicks per user or something like that?
Downloads is the metric that we use. So how many people have downloaded the episode, which today essentially is the same as listening. That's generally the baseline that we use.
But more promotion, like you mentioned, is used for advertising purposes, where you're basically it's a call to action to do something. Has there been any
Oh, there's tons of statistics, mostly out of the US, but there's tons of statistics. If you look up Edison Research, they publish stuff all the time around that. I can share some resources with Meeta, which you can send out to everybody as well. A couple of reports that have come out more recently around advertising in podcast resonance and so on. There are ways to track. So, for example, when we use dynamic insertion, because this technologically it's stitched together, when you hit play, I can know when a file is requested, like an ad is requested. And so my number when we share it with advertisers at the end of a season or a month or whatever, quarter, sorry, is actually fairly accurate to say that's how many times your ad was heard. Right, so we can be sure of that, because that is being stitched when you hit play, as opposed to me just drumming up a number. In the US and stuff, using promo codes and stuff is very popular, right? So you will hear say use this code when you go to Squarespace, and so that's the way they use that as tracking to say that's how many people came from a certain show to us.
Can you track how many people completed the whole episode versus drop-offs?
You can within Apple and Spotify and stuff. You do have that information is available to say you saw where the drop-offs are as well. So you can kind of see like, yeah. I mean, we see generally sometimes you'll see skips happen around ads. So an ad will come on, people skip, and then stuff like that. So you can see that. We don't really use that information very heavily, because it kind of, if there's a lot of drop-off, let's say you're doing an hour. I mean, this is a good way to know how if your show is long enough, right, or too long, is if you're doing an hour-long show and after 30 minutes you see 35 minutes you see a massive drop-off, you know that's where the appetite is for your show, and you can kind of bring it down. You get general stats, right, saying overall your episodes were completed 70% of the way, and that's good enough. For the most part, it means that enough people are completing it, enough people are getting almost to the end. It's also one of the reasons why anyway, but that's true with any content, is you pack stuff up in the beginning. So that's again why we work with brands to kind of say, okay, this is the most important thing, we should bring it up front or later, or things like that. Sorry? Yeah, that's generally what that happens in the editing process after the interview is done, right? We kind of listen through and say, we think this is what creates the most resonance. Can we front some of that information up? I mean, happens a lot, by the way. I mean, you hear most of our episodes, as I said, are about 40 minutes, but the interviews are actually an hour and a half sometimes, right? Because to open up somebody and actually have a conversation with, that's how long it takes. But then sometimes that first half an hour is just them talking about where they went to school, and maybe that's not interesting.
One small quick question. When you are planning an episode, for example, how much time should you do the same introduction in each episode? And how much time should we normally give to something like that?
Our general hit is that if you have a guest on, if you're going to make someone wait 5 minutes for a guest to come up, that's probably not going to be great, especially if they're coming to listen to somebody and I have to listen to you talk for 5 minutes thereafter, right? Because I want to get to the point. So we try to keep that short as much as we can. We try not to keep bios too long and stuff. Honestly, listening to a bio for 5 minutes is actually, I don't enjoy it personally, and I don't see resonance even among other people to do that. I mean, Mark Maron is a good example. His show starts 20 minutes in, and so all I do is I skip straight to 20 minutes and then I start listening, right? Because he throws in 3 ads, he talks about what he did last week. Like, it's wonderful. I'm sure he has an audience for it. So, but ultimately, when you're doing something where you are actually bringing someone on, the point is the conversation with that person. The longer you make someone wait to get to that person, the faster they're dropping off, right? So we don't try to keep that very long, as much as we can.
Can you push some ads in between? Like, what is ad?
Yes, we can. I mean, that's what I was telling you. So the dynamic insertion, that's what it allows us to do. So we have ads recorded that are separate, and then we insert them where we want them to be inserted. So we can absolutely do that. But even then, you know, we have kind of smart. I mean, we've obviously over time we have experience with that. Is how often an ad should be heard, how long an ad should be. These are all considerations you have to do. Right. So obviously, if before you even say hello, you've made me hear 3 ads, I'm probably either going to skip or get out of the show. One of the two is very likely to happen. Your data will tell you that eventually, even if it doesn't in the beginning, but we wouldn't recommend that now, naturally. And it's never going to look good for your brand ultimately.
So there are no questions.
Thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you, guys.